Bones cracked across the crystal ballroom, and the room exploded into screams. Chloe Henderson froze before she could understand what had happened to the man who had been laughing at her seconds earlier. Then a pair of heavily tattooed arms wrapped around her waist. Dawson pulled her close, lifted her from the chaos, and stepped past the man now crumpled on the floor. Chloe had no idea why one of the most dangerous men in Boston had just protected her. She only knew her life would never return to normal after tonight. Friday mornings usually began with pain in her lower back and flour on her hands. Chloe was 24, 5'4", and 265 pounds. She knew exactly how the world saw her. Too big, too soft, too much. People had spent years reminding her to take up less space, speak less loudly, dress more carefully, and accept less than she deserved. But inside Sugar and Rye, her small bakery in South Boston's Harbor District, Chloe did not shrink for anyone. She worked the brioche dough with steady force, her hands moving through flour and butter like she was pushing every insult out of her body. In her bakery, she belonged. She just did not know that by nightfall, the most feared Mafia boss in the city would decide she belonged to him too. Baking was an exact science, a predictable comfort in a life that had suddenly become dangerously chaotic. That chaos had a name, and it usually wore a $3,000 tailored suit, Dawson Ward. To the local police, Dawson was a person of interest in a string of racketeering cases. To the criminal underworld, he was the undisputed boss of the Ward Syndicate, a brutal, highly organized Irish-American Mafia faction that controlled everything from the docks to the underground casinos. To Chloe, he was the terrifyingly quiet man who had walked into her bakery 2 months ago, ordered a black coffee and a single raspberry tart, and left a crisp $100 bill in her tip jar. He had come back every Tuesday and Friday since. The bell above the bakery door chimed, cutting through the jazz playing on the radio. Chloe wiped her forehead with the back of her forearm, leaving a streak of flour across her brow, and turned around. The breath hitched in her throat, lodging there like a stone. Dawson stood in the doorway. He was a massive man, standing 6'5", built like a heavyweight boxer poured into charcoal wool. His dark hair was slicked back, and a faint, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of his violent ascent to power. 2 of his men, suit-clad mountains themselves, remained outside on the pavement, their eyes scanning the street. "Morning, Chloe," Dawson said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated right through the soles of her flour-dusted shoes. "Good morning, Mr. Ward," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. She hated how small she felt around him, despite her size. Most men looked past her, or looked at her with a thinly veiled cocktail of pity and disgust. Dawson looked at her like she was the only meal he had been allowed to eat in a month. His dark, calculating eyes tracked her every movement, lingering on the heavy swell of her breasts under her tight apron, trailing down to the thick curve of her hips. Just Dawson. He corrected gently, stepping up to the glass display case. The scent of expensive sandalwood and faint cigarette smoke overpowered the smell of yeast and vanilla. "You're working early today. Got a big catering order for tomorrow night," Chloe said, wiping her hands on a towel. She refused to meet his eyes, busying herself with the espresso machine. Some private event at the Oak Haven estate. 200 custom pastries. Dawson's jaw ticked. He knew exactly what event she was talking about. It was his event. The annual Ward Syndicate high-stakes poker tournament and charity gala, a front for washing millions in illegal gambling revenue. "I know the event," Dawson said softly. He leaned against the counter. "Your brother Tommy secured the contract for you, didn't he?" Chloe's hands froze on the portafilter. The color drained from her face. She looked up, finally meeting his intense obsidian gaze. "Yes. Tommy said he knew the organizers. He said it was a good opportunity for my business." A dark, dangerous shadow crossed Dawson's face. Though his posture remained casually relaxed, Tommy Henderson was a degenerate gambler. He owed the Ward Syndicate $65,000. Tommy had begged Dawson's lieutenants for a reprieve, offering his sister's catering services for the gala as a down payment on the interest. Normally, Dawson would have ordered Tommy's kneecaps shattered with a titanium bat. But the moment Dawson had learned the baker in question was the soft plus-size girl he had been quietly obsessing over for 2 months, he had halted the hit. "Tommy is a man of many connections," Dawson murmured, the sarcasm entirely lost on Chloe's panic. He reached across the counter. Chloe instinctively flinched, expecting violence, but his large, calloused hand simply cupped her jaw. His thumb, rough and warm, brushed the streak of flour from her cheek. "Don't work yourself to the bone, to sorrow," Dawson whispered, his eyes dropping to her trembling lips. "I want you looking vibrant tomorrow night." He withdrew his hand, dropped a folded $50 bill on the counter for his coffee, and walked out without another word. Chloe stood frozen behind the register, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at her reflection in the stainless steel fridge. She was fat, sweaty, and covered in dough. Why was the most dangerous man in Boston looking at her like he wanted to devour her? By Friday evening, the reality of Tommy's situation crashed down on her. Her brother stumbled into the bakery after closing hours, his face bruised, smelling of cheap whiskey and panic. Through his drunken tears he confessed everything. The debt, the threats, the fact that the catering job wasn't just a gig. It was a desperate plea for his life. "If you don't show up and make them happy, Chloe, they're going to kill me," Tommy sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "Dawson Ward runs that party. He's a monster." Chloe looked down at her hands, still raw from kneading dough. A cold, heavy dread settled in her expansive stomach. Dawson wasn't just a regular customer. He was the boss, holding her brother's life in his hands. The Oakhaven estate was a sprawling Gothic mansion, clear as throat, perched on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. By 9 p.m. on Saturday night, the grand ballroom was swarming with Boston's most elite, corrupt, and lethal figures. Politicians rubbed shoulders with cartel distributors, while wait staff in crisp tuxedos carried silver trays of champagne and blood money. Chloe stood behind the massive 24 dessert banquet she had painstakingly arranged. Towers of delicate macarons, rich chocolate ganache tarts, and spun sugar cages gleamed under the crystal chandeliers. She felt utterly humiliated. Tommy had insisted she dress for the occasion, burning through her meager savings to buy a dress that fit the strict black-tie dress code. She wore a deep maroon velvet gown. It was the only thing in the plus-size boutique that didn't look like a mother of the bride tent. The dress hugged her thick waist tightly, plunging deeply at the neckline to showcase her heavy breasts, the fabric clinging to her wide hips and thick thighs. She had tried to smooth her belly with shapewear, but it only squeezed her flesh painfully, making her feel massive, cumbersome, and entirely out of place among the sea of rail-thin mob wives in sleek designer silk. Every time a man in a tuxedo walked past her table, Chloe caught the micro-expressions, the subtle sneers, the dismissive glances. She was a peasant serving kings, a fat girl in a room full of predators who valued women only as decorative, fragile ornaments. Except for one. From the second-floor mezzanine, Dawson Ward stood in the shadows, a glass of amber bourbon in his hand. He hadn't taken his eyes off Chloe since she arrived. The maroon velvet dress was a revelation. It clung to every soft curve, every heavy roll of flesh he had fantasized about pressing his hands into. His men knew better than to approach the dessert table. He had explicitly ordered his inner circle to keep their distance from her. She was his. She just didn't fully realize it yet. Down on the floor, the evening was growing rowdy. Bradley Hayes, a high-ranking cocaine distributor from the Miami outfit, was a guest of honor tonight. Bradley was notoriously sleazy, a handsome, arrogant man who wore his wealth like a weapon. He had a reputation for crude behavior, fueled by endless lines of premium narcotics. Around 11:30 p.m., Bradley swaggered over to the dessert table, a glass of champagne sloshing in his hand. He was flanked by two laughing associates. Chloe stiffened, her customer service smile plastering itself onto her face. "What can I get for you, gentlemen?" she asked politely, folding her hands over her stomach to hide her nerves. Bradley didn't look at the pastries. His glassy, predatory eyes raked slowly over Chloe's body, from the heavy swell of her cleavage down to her wide hips. A slick, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well now," Bradley slurred, setting his glass down on her pristine table, nearly knocking over a tray of eclairs. "Look at all this sugar. You've definitely had your fair share of the inventory, haven't you, sweetheart?" His associates chuckled. Chloe's face burned hot with deep, familiar shame. The fat jokes. She had heard them all her life, but they still stung like a whip. "If you don't want a pastry, sir, please step back. You're blocking the station." "Feisty," Bradley purred. He stepped around the table, invading her personal space. The smell of liquor and stale cocaine wafted off him. "I like them thick, real thick, like a goddamn mattress." "Please step away from me," Chloe said, her voice shaking now. She backed up, but her wide hips hit the edge of the prep cart behind her. She was trapped. "Don't be shy, big girl," Bradley whispered. He reached out and grabbed her waist. His fingers dug painfully into the soft, thick flesh of her side through the velvet. He smiled, a gleaming, arrogant grin, fully believing his cartel connections made him untouchable in this room. "Another man might want a skinny little model, but I know what to do with all this heavy." The air in the room suddenly dropped 10 degrees. Dawson Ward didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply materialized from the crowd with the terrifying, silent speed of an apex predator. Bradley barely had time to register the shadow falling over him. He turned his head, his arrogant smile still plastered on his face. "Hey, Don. Just getting acquainted with the crack." The sound was sickeningly loud, like a baseball bat striking a watermelon. Dawson's right fist wrapped around a heavy brass Zippo lighter, connected directly with the hinge of Bradley's jaw. The sheer brutal force of the blow lifted the Miami distributor completely off his feet. Bradley crashed into the dessert table, destroying a tower of macarons before collapsing onto the marble floor. His jaw was visibly detached, hanging at a grotesque, unnatural angle. Blood sprayed across the pristine white tablecloth. His eyes rolled back into his head, his body convulsing in shock. The music ground to a halt. The ballroom went dead silent. 200 ruthless criminals held their breath. Bradley's associates instinctively reached for their holstered weapons, but before they could even draw, 20 of Dawson's heavily armed men had laser sights painted on their chests. Dawson stood over the bleeding man, his chest heaving under his tailored suit, his knuckles split and dripping crimson onto the floor. His eyes were completely black, stripped of all humanity. If anyone else looks at her, smiles at her, or breathes in her direction, Dawson's voice boomed through the silent hall, quiet but laced with absolute lethal authority. "I will peel the skin from your skull while you are still awake to feel it." Chloe was hyperventilating, pressing her hands over her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand, her heavy frame shaking against the prep cart. Dawson turned to her. The monster vanished, replaced by a fierce, possessive warmth. He stepped into her space, ignoring the chaos, ignoring the blood on his hands. He didn't ask for permission. He reached down, wrapping one massive arm around her broad back, and the other tightly beneath her thick thighs. "I'm too heavy." Chloe gasped instinctively as she felt herself being lifted off the ground. She weighed 265 pounds. No man had ever tried to pick her up. "You're perfect," Dawson growled against her neck. His muscles bunched and strained beneath his suit, but he lifted her bridal style with astonishing raw strength. She felt entirely weightless in his arms, her soft belly pressing against his hard, armored chest. Dawson carried her away from the blood, away from the staring crowd, marching straight out the double doors of the ballroom and into the cold night air, leaving a shattered cartel boss bleeding on the floor behind them. Cold, clear's throat wind whipped across the cobblestone driveway as Dawson strode away from the mansion, his polished leather shoes crunching against the gravel. Chloe clung to his broad shoulders, her face buried in the crook of his neck. The scent of copper from his bleeding knuckles mingled with his rich sandalwood cologne, creating a dizzying, intoxicating haze in her mind. Panic vibrated through every heavy curve of her body. She was acutely aware of her exposed thighs gripping his waist, the slit of her velvet dress having ridden up during the chaotic extraction. Yet, Dawson didn't stagger. He carried her 265-pound frame with a terrifying, effortless grace, as if she weighed nothing more than a bundle of silk. A sleek, armored black Maybach idled at the base of the driveway, its engine a low, menacing purr. The driver, a scarred man in a tailored suit, threw the rear door open the second he saw them approaching, his eyes carefully averted from Chloe's exposed legs. Dawson ducked and deposited her into the plush leather interior, with surprising gentleness. Before she could scramble to cover herself, he slid in right beside her, his massive frame taking up the rest of the back seat. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing them in a soundproof, dimly lit cocoon. "Drive. The penthouse," Dawson commanded. The car surged forward instantly, leaving the flashing lights and impending chaos of the Oakhaven estate behind. Chloe pressed herself against the opposite door, her chest heaving. The adrenaline was beginning to crash, leaving behind a cold, sharp terror. She looked at his hands. The skin over his knuckles was split, stained deep crimson with Bradley Hayes's blood. You broke his jaw," Chloe stammered, her voice cracking. "He's going to kill you. They're going to kill my brother. Tommy owes you. And now you've started a war over quiet," Dawson interrupted, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that commanded immediate obedience. He reached into a hidden compartment, retrieving a first aid kit and a clean linen towel. He wiped the blood from his hands with methodical, chilling calmness. "Don't tell me to be quiet," Chloe suddenly snapped, the sheer absurdity of the night snapping her fragile tether to reality. Tears of frustration spilled hot down her cheeks. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That man is a cartel boss. And you hit him because what? He made a fat joke? I've been dealing with pigs like him my whole life. I didn't need you to shatter his skull." Dawson stopped wiping his hands. He tossed the bloodied towel onto the floorboard and turned to her. The raw, unhinged darkness in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. "He didn't make a joke, Chloe," Dawson said softly, sliding across the leather seat until his thigh pressed flush against her heavy one. "He put his hands on what belongs to me. If we weren't in a room full of federal informants, I wouldn't have just broken his jaw. I would have taken his hands." Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs. She pressed herself tighter against the door, the plush velvet of her dress riding up further, exposing the thick, dimpled flesh of her thigh. She scrambled to pull the fabric down, a fresh wave of humiliation washing over her. "Stop," Dawson murmured. He reached out, his large, calloused hand capturing her wrists. He gently but firmly pulled her hands away from her dress. "Stop trying to hide from me. I don't belong to you," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm just a baker. My brother is the one who owes you $65,000. I'm collateral." A dark, bitter laugh escaped Dawson's chest. He let go of her wrists and instead cupped her jaw, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. "Tommy's debt was erased the moment you walked into that ballroom tonight," Dawson confessed, his gaze dropping to the deep plunge of her neckline, watching the heavy, rapid rise and fall of her chest. "The $65,000 was nothing to me. But when my lieutenants told me his sister was the beautiful, stubborn baker from South Boston who handed me my coffee every Tuesday, I used it. I used his pathetic gambling problem to force you into my world. Because every time I walked into your shop you wouldn't look at me. You hid behind your aprons and your counters." Chloe stared at him, completely paralyzed. "You manipulated my family's life just to get me into a room?" I would have burned the city to the ground to get you into that room, Dawson corrected quietly. His hand slid down from her jaw, trailing along the thick column of her neck, over her collarbone, and resting heavily on the soft, pronounced curve of her waist. His fingers dug slightly into her plush flesh, possessing it, claiming it. I've watched men look past you, Dawson continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. I've watched you try to shrink yourself, wearing those baggy sweaters, pulling at your shirts. It drives me insane. You are a goddess, Chloe. I don't want fragile. I don't want bones. I want a woman I can bury my hands in. Every heavy, beautiful inch of you. Chloe gasped as he leaned in, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin beneath her ear. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. Nobody had ever looked at her wide hips and thick waist and seen power. They had only ever seen a punchline, but the terrifying Mafia boss holding her didn't see a flaw. He saw a feast. The Miami cartel will retaliate, Chloe whispered, closing her eyes as his warmth enveloped her. Let them. Dawson growled against her skin, his hand sliding up to grip the back of her neck. I am the king of this city, and tonight they just met their queen. The fallout was immediate, and Kata's trophic. For 4 agonizing days, Chloe was confined to the sprawling luxury of Dawson's glass-walled penthouse overlooking the Boston skyline. She was guarded by heavily armed men who treated her with absolute, terrifying reverence. Dawson was rarely there. The city had descended into a shadow war. Bradley Hayes had survived the blow, his jaw wired shut in a private hospital. But his cartel had demanded blood. Sirens echoed through the nights, and the local news was flooded with reports of unprecedented gang-related violence at the docks and warehouses. Despite the velvet cage she found herself in, Chloe felt a strange, terrifying sense of belonging. Dawson's men brought her whatever she needed, baking supplies, new clothes, comforting words, but she missed her bakery. She missed her sanctuary. On the evening of the 5th day, the skyline was stained orange by the setting sun when the penthouse elevator dinged. Dawson stepped out. He looked exhausted. His suit jacket was missing. His white shirt was stained with soot and dark suspicious splatters, and a fresh cut bled freely over his cheekbone. Chloe dropped the mixing bowl she was holding in the massive kitchen and ran to him. The heavy thud of her bare feet against the hardwood floor echoed through the penthouse. She didn't think about her size, her wobbly thighs, or the oversized t-shirt she wore. She just threw her arms around his thick waist. Dawson groaned, a sound of pure relief, and buried his face in her hair, his arms locking around her broad back, pulling her soft stomach flush against his hard abdomen. You're hurt, she breathed, pulling back to inspect his face. It's over, Dawson said, his voice raspy and completely drained. He leaned into her soft touch as she wiped the blood from his cheek with her thumb. Bradley Hayes is no longer a problem. The Miami outfit has withdrawn entirely. The city is secure. Chloe let out a shuddering breath, resting her forehead against his chest. Thank God. Dawson's hands slid down to cup her heavy, wide hips. He squeezed her plush flesh, grounding himself in her reality. But there was a shadow in his eyes, a hesitation that sent a spike of dread through her heart. There was collateral damage, he said quietly. Chloe stiffened. Tommy? Tommy is safe. He's on a plane to Dublin right now, far away from any casinos, Dawson assured her quickly. He took a deep breath. But Bradley's men, before we cornered them, they went after what they thought I loved most. They didn't know you were here. Chloe's blood ran cold. My bakery, Dawson nodded slowly. They firebombed it, Tesoro. It's gone. Burned to the foundation. The air was sucked from Chloe's lungs. Sugar and Rye wasn't just a building. It was her identity. It was the only place in the world where she hadn't felt judged for the space she took up. Her knees buckled under her heavy frame. Dawson caught her instantly, refusing to let her fall. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her to the massive velvet sofa in the center of the living room, pulling her into his lap. He cradled her large frame easily, letting her cry into his ruined shirt. "I lost it," she sobbed, her thick body shaking with grief. "I put everything into that place. It was all I had." "No," Dawson said fiercely, his hand stroking her hair. "You have me. You have everything I own." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick folded sheaf of architectural blueprints, stained slightly at the edges with ash. He placed them on the glass coffee table in front of them. Chloe wiped her eyes, looking down at the papers. They were detailed designs for a massive, state-of-the-art commercial bakery. It was 3 times the size of her old shop, located right in the heart of the upscale financial district. "I bought the property yesterday," Dawson murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The contractors start pouring the foundation tomorrow. It's yours, Chloe. Every brick, every oven. I will build you an empire of sugar and glass, right in the center of my city, where everyone will know exactly who you are." Chloe stared at the blueprints, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the gesture. "Dawson, I can't accept this. This is millions of dollars. You don't have a choice," he growled playfully, his hand sliding under her shirt to caress the soft, warm skin of her stomach. "I destroyed your quiet life. I dragged you into the blood and the dirt. The least I can do is build you a castle to bake in." He shifted, gently nudging her until she was straddling his lap. Her heavy thighs bracketed his hips, her soft, generous curves pressing down against him. For the first time in her life, she didn't try to pull away. She didn't apologize for her weight. She sat tall, looking down into the eyes of the most dangerous man on the East Coast, seeing nothing but utter devotion. "You're a monster, Dawson Ward," she whispered, a watery smile finally breaking through her tears. Dawson looked at Chloe and did not deny what he was. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am dangerous, but never to you. From this moment on, no one gets to make you feel weak, unwanted, or ashamed of who you are." Chloe held his gaze, still shaken by everything that had happened, but no longer afraid of the space she occupied. For years, people had reduced her to her size, her bakery, and the way she looked in a room full of people who thought they were better than her. Dawson saw all of that, but he also saw her strength, her loyalty, and the woman she had been forced to protect alone. He took her hand and led her out of the ballroom, while the Ward syndicate moved behind them, silent and controlled. Chloe was no longer the baker everyone underestimated. She was the woman Dawson had chosen in front of enemies, witnesses, and an entire city that would never look at her the same way again. That night, Chloe stopped shrinking for the world. Did Dawson go too far, or did Chloe finally get the protection she deserved? Tell us in the comments. If you enjoyed this Mafia romance with a strong, curvy heroine, dangerous loyalty, and a powerful ending, like, share, and subscribe for more stories.